Hello, welcome to our third lesson, emergency management. This is under emergency incidents. Once again, my name is Wayne. I hope from the introduction part, which we did in lesson 1 and lesson 2, you are able to get a picture of what we are discussing and where we are going and what we shall be learning throughout this course in this semester. So today we are going to focus on emergency management. How do we manage emergencies? Who is responsible for managing emergencies at organizational level? Who is responsible for managing emergencies, and how do we manage emergencies? Remember, we said emergencies occur in different ways. Emergencies occur at different times. The nature of each emergency is different. So the management of these emergencies will also be different. However, there are steps or procedures that are almost similar as relates to all emergencies. There are many emergency management service protocols that apply in an emergency, which usually start with planning before an emergency occurs. So number one thing in emergency management is planning. One commonly used system for demonstrating the phase is shown here on this on the right. I'll show you that one. The planning phase starts at preparedness, when the agencies decide how to respond to a given incident or a set of circumstances. This should ideally include lines of command and control and the division of activities between agencies. We are talking of several agencies, or we are talking of different kinds of agencies that deal with emergencies, responding to emergencies. So it starts with preparedness. And even at organizational level, in your organization, you must have an emergency crisis plan. And the plan will outline how do you prepare. And this will involve the equipment you need, the people you need, the training you need, the communication you need, and the support you need in terms of communication from internally, communication externally, calling support from the government, calling support from other stakeholders. That is an aspect of preparedness. So emergencies evolve in different ways, and agencies dealing with emergencies will prepare at the planning phase. They prepare so that if there is an emergency, they know how are we going to approach it. Remember also, in emergency management, we say that emergencies are very, very different. For example, how you manage a terrorist attack incident is completely different to how you manage a fire incident. How you manage a fire incident, it is completely different to how you manage a bomb threat. How you manage a bomb threat is completely different to how you manage a building collapse. So this must be taken into consideration during the planning phase, and we have spoken about preparedness. Agencies, so we have spoken about issues related to division of lines, including command and control, and division of activities between agencies. Also, this potentially avoids negative situations such as 3 separate agencies all starting an unofficial emergency shelter for victims of a disaster. When we talk about control and command being in line with each other, you can remember the issue we had at Westgate, where there wasn't a clear lines of command and who was in control, and that is why there was a clash between different agencies of the Kenyan government who were responding to the incident. There were the attack, there were miscommunication between the Kenya Defense Forces, between the Kenya Police, between other responders. There wasn't clear lines of command and control, and that was a major problem that led to the issue getting out of hand. And then we say agencies may then be involved in recovery following the incident, where they assist in the clear up from the incident or help the people involved overcome their mental trauma. The final phase in the circle is mitigation, which involves taking steps to ensure no reoccurrence is possible, or putting additional plans in place to ensure less damage is done. This should face this should feed back into the preparedness stage, which with updated plans in place to deal with future emergencies, hence completing the cycle. So we can say that emergency management starts with preparedness. Emergency management starts with preparedness, and then which includes also preparedness is under actually planning, and then it moves to actually responding to the incident, and then there is also recovery, and then there is mitigation. There is a mitigation after recovery. So we say it starts with preparedness, then it goes to response, then it goes to recovery, then it goes to mitigation. So even at organizational level, under your crisis management plans, if you are a security manager or if you are a security officer, then you should remember the crisis management circle. And the crisis management circle, as we are going to see shortly, it starts with the preparedness, which is emergency response plans, training and exercises, and sirens. People must be familiar with the training. People must conduct drills, and people must be familiar with the sirens. Which siren means which kind of disaster are we in? And then we go to response, which is life safety, incident stabilization, property preservation, evacuation, and shelters, and mass care. After response, now it means the incident has occurred. Now you are actually in the crisis management mode. You respond to it. Remember, we said from the beginning, the priorities in this case when you respond is to save life, to minimize the situation from getting worse, to protect, to minimize further damage of property, and also to take control of the situation. Those are some of the priorities that you have to take into consideration. When we talk about recovery, we talk about economic recovery, debris management, housing, health and social services. And then when we talk about mitigation, we talk about public education, hazard and vulnerability assessment, and improved infrastructure. Mitigation, this is where we are. What we are doing now is mitigation. We are creating public education. We train the people, we train the officers, and this also relates also to preparedness, emergency plans, trainings, people understanding the type of sirens and whatever. Please check at your organization level if you have crisis management plans and if your crisis management plans are in line with this cycle. Check at your organizational level if you have management crisis management plans and if they are in the form of this cycle. Also, we talk of a state emergency. In the event of a major incident, such as a civil unrest or a major disaster, many governments maintain the right to declare a state of emergency. Many governments maintain the right to declare a state of emergency, which gives them extensive powers over the daily lives of their citizens and may include temporary curtailment on certain civil rights, including the right to travel. For instance, to discourage looting of an evacuated area, a shoot-on-site policy, however unlikely to occur, may be publicized. A shoot-on-site policy, however unlikely to occur, may be publicized. That is, the government may declare a state of emergency depending on the ongoing situation, and it may call for some curtailment of civil rights, including the right to travel. The government may say, due to this emergency, there's no traveling. You remember when we had the COVID situation, there was no traveling. It was an emergency, and people were being curtailed from traveling because the more you travel, the more you get into contact with those people who are infected, and the more you get infected, the more you continue to spread the virus. These are some of the things that are very, very, very important when it comes to crisis management. And then also, we talk a little bit about risk and vulnerability assessment. Risk and vulnerability assessment. Risk and vulnerability assessment. And under risk and vulnerability assessment, we are first going to discuss disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction. The concept and the practice of reducing disasters risks through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters, including through reduced exposure to hazards, lessened vulnerabilities of people and property, wise management of land and the environment, and improved preparedness for adverse events. So disaster reduction is actually a concept and practice of reducing disaster risks through systematic efforts. Through systematic efforts. That is what we call disaster reduction. Also, another concept that we are going to look at as we move along in this course is an early warning system. Early warning system is the set of capacities needed to generate and disseminate timely and meaningful warning information to enable individuals, communities, organizations threatened by a hazard to prepare and to act appropriately in sufficient time to reduce the possibility of harm or loss. That is early warning system. When I was working in the Republic of Maldives, there was always alerts, early warning system of the likelihood of a tsunami. You remember in 2004, there was a serious tsunami from these areas of Thailand that hit the whole of the islands in the Indian Ocean, and it ended up even at the coastal Kenya, at the Mombasa area. You remember that tsunami claimed many lives, destroyed many properties. Now there are tsunami warning systems in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, all over. There are tsunami warning systems. You know, a tsunami is generated when there is an earthquake, a small earthquake inside the ocean or in the nearby islands. This earthquake may generate a tsunami, which is a flow of high meters of water at a very high velocity, and it destroys the property and structures and everything that it encounters. So early warning systems are there to warn people that there is likely to be a danger, there is likely to be an emergency. And then again, we talk about emergency management. The organization and emergency management of resources and responsibilities for addressing all aspects of emergencies, in particular preparedness, response, and initial recovery steps. So we say emergency management is the organization and the management of resources and responsibilities for addressing all aspects of emergencies, in particular preparedness, response, and initial recovery steps. Another concept also that we need to put into mind, going back to the crisis management cycle, is mitigation. Mitigation is the lessening or limitation of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. Mitigation, the lessening or limitation of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. And then another term also is preparedness. Preparedness, you all know this as security professionals. Preparedness involves the knowledge and capacities developed by the government, professional response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely, imminent, or current hazard events or conditions. Preparedness, we need to prepare. And this is where in our country we are a little bit, we are doing better now. And like many years ago, we are in better position because at least currently I can say our government is really supporting the forces and the responders to prepare accordingly. Though we still lack equipments, we still lack logistical means, we still lack finances, we still even lack the people who are well trained and well prepared to respond to emergencies, but we are going there. I'm saying this because based on the emergencies that we have faced several years back, you have seen how disorganized we have been and how we have not been able to manage these disasters effectively. However, the last attack, which was Lucid D2, was a little bit well managed compared to the attack at Westgate, compared to the attack at 1998 Nairobi Embassy, US Embassy Nairobi bombing, and compared to the Garissa attack where we lost so many students. That is when I'm talking about terrorism. Even when we talk about fire, you have seen that there has been a major fires in Kenya, and the response has been chaotic. However, slowly, we are getting there, and I believe that in future we are going to be in good shape. Then we talk about prevention, the outright avoidance of adverse impacts of hazards related disasters. I don't need to talk much about that. You know already about prevention. And then we talk public awareness. This is what we are doing: trainings, creating public awareness, empowering people to understand how to manage emergencies and how to respond to these issues. And at organizational level, as I have always said, as a security manager, as a security professional, you have a responsibility to make an effort, to walk an extra mile, to add value by conducting public awareness of the people in your organization. That if we are in an emergency, please take cover, please behave this way, please act this way, please act this way. It is an aspect of training. Also, recovery is a term that you know, the restoration and improvement where appropriate of facilities, livelihoods, and living conditions of disaster-affected communities. And then we have response. Response is actually responding to the situation. You know, when there is a situation, security is number one in responding to this situation. And then there is also risk. Risk, which is the combination of the probability of an event and its negative consequences. Risk. The risk is high, the risk is low, the risk is medium. For example, currently we can say the risk of terrorist attack in Kenya, it is high. You know that when these people are quiet, it means that they are planning something. Since 2022, we have not seen any major event, but we have to be always on standby because the risk of terrorism facing us is very high. And then we say sustainability development is another term, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then we have vulnerability, the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. So vulnerability is the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard, which means that you are vulnerable, you have weaknesses, that if your security system has weaknesses, then you are likely to be hit by a disaster and you will not be able to prevent it. Let's talk a little bit about hazard and hazard assessment. Hazard and hazard assessment. I will refer to my notes here. Hazard and hazard assessment. A dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihood and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. That is a hazard. Before beginning the hazard evaluation and risk assessment process, a researcher must define the scope of work. What are the tasks that must be evaluated? A well-defined scope of work is a key starting point for all steps in the risk assessment and hazard analysis. You, as a security professional, you have to learn something about risk, hazard, and hazard assessment. Some people call it risk and risk assessment. You have to understand the difference between hazard and risk, and then how to conduct a hazard assessment or a risk assessment. And we say, before beginning a hazard evaluation and a risk assessment process, a researcher must first define the scope of work. What are the tasks that must be evaluated, and then define a well-defined scope of work as the starting point. And then we say that hazard control. What is hazard control? And we see that hazard control is when evaluating the risks associated with specific hazards. The results of this evaluation should guide in the selection of risk management techniques, including elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. These are some of the controls, or these are some of the management aspects that we use to manage hazards, which is elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. In the following lesson, which will be lesson number 4, I will touch a little bit on how we conduct elimination and how we do substitution and how we do use engineering controls and how we use administrative controls and also personal protective equipment. This is known as the hazard hierarchy of controls. Hazard hierarchy of controls. So if you look at the hazard hierarchy of controls, you will see that on the top there is elimination, and then there is substitution, and then there is engineering controls, and then there is administrative controls, and then there is personal protective equipment. We are talking about hazard control. When we talk about elimination, we talk about physically removing the hazard. Physically removing the hazard. When we talk about substitution, we talk about replacing the hazard. When we talk about engineering controls, we are talking about to isolate people from the hazard. And when we talk about administrative controls, we talk about change the way people work. Change the way people work. And then when we talk about personal protective equipment, which you know is protect the worker with the personal protective equipment. This is what we call hazard control, which is related to crisis management. Hazard control is related also to crisis management, because the moment we control the hazards, then the moment we are able to now to manage emergencies that may occur effectively. So that even if emergencies occur, already you have an aspect of hazard control in place. So hazard control ensures that we prevent the hazards from occurring. And when we prevent the hazards from occurring, then we are actually conducting what we call crisis management. It is an aspect of crisis management. We talk about a little bit about elimination, and we have said elimination and substitution. The most preferred method of controlling risks is to eliminate the hazard altogether. In most cases, elimination is not feasible, and when possible, substitution is the best approach to hazard mitigation. When possible, substitute less hazardous agents in place of their hazardous counterparts. This also applies to conditions and activities. Examples include substituting tolerance for benzene non-lead-based paints for lead-based ones, or stock table source for existing traditional table source. Those are some of the ways that we can talk about substitution. Substitution, they say, it is the best approach to hazard mitigation, substitution. Then we look briefly at engineering controls, and we see that engineering controls consist of a variety of methods for minimizing hazards, including process control, enclosure and isolation and ventilation. Also, process controls involve changing the way that a job activity is performed in order to reduce risk. And then examples of this include using wet methods when drilling or grinding, or using temperature controls to minimize vapor generation. Enclosure and isolation are targeted at keeping the chemical in and the researcher out, or vice versa. Glove boxes are a good example of enclosure and isolation. Interlock system for lasers and machinery are other good examples of isolation processes. I'm referring to my notes here so that I can see clearly what we are talking about. And then we also briefly look at administrative controls. Administrative controls are controls which alter the way work is performed. They may consist of policies, training, standard operating procedures, guidelines, personal hygiene practices, work scheduling, etc. And remember, it is the work of security to enforce this. Mainly, it is the work of security department to enforce administrative controls. However, meetings will be held with all management people. These policies will be put in place. Training will be conducted by HR and also security. Standard operating procedures and guidelines will be implemented and put in place. Personal hygiene practices will be put in place. Work scheduling will be done as per department. However, it still comes to security to enforce these things, to ensure that the people abide by the policies, that the people abide by the rules, that the people abide by personal hygiene, including use of personal protective equipment. So when you are patrolling in the premises as a security officer or a security manager, it is also your responsibility to check that people are abiding by administrative controls. These controls are meant to minimize the exposure to the hazard and should only be used when the exposure cannot be completely mitigated through elimination, substitution, or engineering controls. When we come to these policies, they should only be used when the risk cannot be completely mitigated through elimination, substitution, or engineering controls. And then also we have a look at a small talk about personal protective equipment, which you know, as you can see here, we have a lot of personal protective equipment. We have personal protective wear, personal protective for earphones, we have gloves, we have masks, we have all these things, helmets that are very, very, very important for employees to use. I'll not talk much about this one because you know already, as a person who is involved in the security of any facility, it is your job to ensure that people are using personal protective gear. And then also, we shall talk about a little bit about vulnerability, capacity, and risk. Vulnerability. Vulnerability, we say, it is a weakness. Weakness in a system or weakness in a type of operation that can open a door for hazards to occur. Vulnerability, susceptibility of a person, group, or society to physical or emotional injury, or a person or group liable to injury. As far as hazards and disasters are concerned, the concept of vulnerability is to link the relationship that people have with their environment to social forces and institutions and the cultural values that sustain them. So vulnerability is a weakness. You have to make sure that we say, for example, security design is made of three major concepts. It's made of the people, it's made of the equipment, and it is made of the policies and procedures. If we have a weakness in the policies, then it means we have a vulnerability in the security design. If we have weak people on the ground, as in manpower, then it means we have a weakness or a vulnerability in the overall security design. That is what we are talking about. Equally, in crisis management, vulnerability refers to that weakness in the system or in the group of people that they are unable to prevent or to contain a situation should it occur. Capacity. When we talk about capacity, we say that within a community, all the available resources that can reduce risk level and disaster effects. Frequent term used in disaster is capacity building. Capacity building is the effort to develop human skills within a community to reduce risk levels. So capacity building is the efforts to develop human skills within a community to reduce risk levels. Even now, what we are doing, it is capacity building. We are developing the capacity for people to understand that emergencies can occur and we should have plans on how to manage them. Also, we talk a little bit about risk. This concept, we are going to talk about them in detail as we go along in our course. We say that risk is the occurrence probability of a hazard that trigger a disaster with an desirable outcome. Risk involves an exposure to a chance injury or loss. Risk generally described in terms of probability. Risk is generally described in terms of probability. A risk can also be defined as the probability of loss. Risk depends on three elements. Risk depends on three elements: hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. The hazard, the vulnerability, which is the weakness, and the exposure to the hazard. So that is what we call risk. Then we shall also be discussing about vulnerability types of vulnerability. Vulnerability varies significantly within community and over time. This definition identifies vulnerability as characteristics of the element of interest, community, system, or asset, which is independent of its exposure. However, in common use, the word is often used more broadly to include the element's exposure. We have spoken about vulnerability, and we say there are four main types of vulnerability. please write something down here. 4 main types of vulnerability, and we say number 1 is physical vulnerability. Physical vulnerability may be determined by aspects such as population density levels, remoteness of a settlement, the site, design and materials used for critical infrastructure and for housing, etc. And then we say an example is wooden homes are less likely to collapse in an earthquake, but are more vulnerable to fire. That is what we call physical vulnerability. Wooden houses are less likely to collapse in an earthquake, but are more vulnerable to fire. And then we say that is number 1, physical vulnerability. Number 2 is social vulnerability. Social vulnerability refers to the inability of people, organizations, and societies to withstand adverse impacts or hazards due to characteristics inherent in social interactions, institutions, and systems of cultural values. It is linked to the level of well-being of individuals, communities, and society. It includes aspects related to levels of literacy and education, the existence of peace and security, access to basic human rights, systems of good governance, social equity, positive traditional values, customs, and ideological beliefs, and overall collective organizational systems. Example: when flooding occurs, some citizens, such as children, elderly, and differently able, may be unable to protect themselves or evacuate if necessary. So social vulnerability refers to the inability of people, organizations, and societies to withstand adverse impacts of hazards due to certain characteristics. That is what we call social vulnerability. And then number 3, we have economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability, as you all know, is the inability or the level of vulnerability is highly dependent upon the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. The poor are usually more vulnerable to disasters because they lack the resources to build steady structures and put other engineering measures in place to protect themselves from being negatively impacted by disasters. Example: poor families may live in squatter settlements because they cannot afford to live in safer, more expensive areas. So that is what we call economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability revolves around the finances, the ability to put together proper structures, the ability to put together proper defenses. It means that you are vulnerable when you lack the money to stay in a well-secured houses. It means your economical vulnerability is very high. That is why you find that people sometimes live at areas that are very dangerous without adequate security coverage because they lack economic power. So they have economic vulnerability. And then also when we talk about crisis management, we talk about environmental vulnerability. Environmental vulnerability refers to natural resource depletion and resource degradation are key aspects of environmental vulnerability. Example: wetlands such as the Caroni swamp are sensitive to increasing salinity from seawater and pollution from stormwater runoff containing agricultural chemicals, eroded soils, etc. Environment. So when we talk about crisis management, when we talk about vulnerabilities, we also have to talk about environmental vulnerability. Environmental vulnerability. Environmental vulnerability also is another very, very important aspect when we talk about crisis management. Depletion of resources are key aspects of environmental vulnerability. After this, we are going to talk briefly about risk analysis and risk rating. Risk analysis and risk rating. Risk analysis and rating considers the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses, deaths, injuries, property, livelihood, economic activity disrupted or environmentally damaged, resulting from interactions between natural or human-induced hazards and vulnerable conditions. This is a process we conduct risk analysis at management level. When you become a security manager, these are some of the things that you will need to be do from time to time. Conducting risk analysis. Risk can be evaluated using the following equation: that risk is equivalent to probability of hazard times degree of vulnerability. So this is quite something that you need to learn, how to conduct a risk analysis and how to carry out the ratings. And then we say that there are different ways of dealing with risks, such as risk acceptance, an informed decision to accept the possible consequences and likelihood of a particular risk. That is what we call risk acceptance. An informed decision to accept the possible consequences and likelihood of a particular risk. And then there is risk avoidance, an informed decision to avoid involvement in activities leading to risk realization. Risk avoidance. If you want to avoid risk, for example, you wanted to travel to Nairobi and you hear that people are fighting along the way. And Nakuru, people are fighting. You are at Kakamega and you want to go to Nairobi and people are fighting at Nakuru. So what do? You avoid traveling to Nairobi. You stay at home. Or you decide, I will travel another day, I'll not travel today. That is what you call risk avoidance. And what is risk acceptance? People are fighting at Nakuru. You weigh the chances. How likely am I going to be involved in this fight? You see that by using um, traveling a bus and a personal car, I will not very much be involved in this situation. So you accept it. You say, however, if the situation comes my way, I will deal with it along the way. That is what we call risk acceptance. And then risk reduction refers to the application of appropriate techniques to reduce the likelihood of risk occurrence and its consequences. Risk reduction. For example, people are fighting at Nakuru. You wanted to travel with a public car. You see that the danger of being involved in the fight using a public car is very high. A private car is very high. You decide to travel with a train. So you know that with a train from Kakamega to Nairobi, it is going through Nakuru, you have actually reduced the risk to yourself. And then we say risk transfer involves shifting of the burden of risk to another party. One of the most common forms of risk transfer is insurance. One of the common forms of risk transfer is insurance. So just list down. There are different ways of dealing with risk. One is risk acceptance. Two is risk avoidance. Three is risk reduction. Four is risk transfer. Can you kindly do research and read more on those terms? And then, as you can see briefly, this is how we conduct risk analysis using a matrix. And the matrix usually talks about likelihood of occurrence and what are the levels. Is it low, medium, or high? And if it happens, what is the impact? Will it be major injury? Will it be fatality? Or will it be minimal injuries? So this is how we grade, and then we come up finally with the score. And the score actually shows us whether it is minimal risk, maintain existing measures, whether it is low risk, review existing measures, whether it is a medium risk, improve control measures, whether it is a high risk, consider stopping the activity, or whether it is extreme risk, do not proceed. And then response agency management systems, disaster and emergency preparedness in Kenya is perceived to be fragmented, with the country often better at reactive than proactive action. We spoke about a little bit about being proactive and reactive. Reactive is responding to a situation, but being proactive is trying to put in place measures that will ensure the emergency doesn't occur. And you see in Kenya, our situation is that we are likely to react to situations because in most cases we are not prepared. However, things are changing, government is changing, and we are continuing to train our people. Government is continuing to train its forces, even in the private sector. Private companies are continuing to train the security officers and the people on preparedness. So I can say things are changing for the better, though we are still far away, but I know one day, one time we are going to reach there. I have introduced several concepts today in this lesson, several concepts that are already in your domain or are new to you. And I would like you to understand that we are going to be touching slowly on these concepts as we move along. As we move along, we are going to be touching on these concepts as relates to crisis management and incident management, or under emergency incidents. This is all the same things. Incident management or emergency incident management, these are similar areas of thought. I would like us to stop there, and we meet again in the next weekend for the 5th lesson, and we shall cover some other areas also related to crisis management or related to emergency incident management. Thank you very much, and see you when we meet for the next class. Thank you.